Right, back on track now. Chase Downham is the Indiana State Director of Americans for Prosperity, one of the nation's leading conservative grassroots organizations focused on limited government and free market principles. Yeah! Most recently, Chase worked for the Indiana Chamber of Commerce as the organization's manager of political affairs. And in this role, Chase worked to recruit and help elect chamber-endorsed candidates for Indiana House and Senate, as well as drive the chamber's legislative grassroots activity. A native of Muncie, Indiana, Chase graduated with high distinction from Indiana University School of Public Environmental Affairs. I went to Purdue. Earning a degree in public affairs with concentration in policy analysis. In addition to Chambers, past political experiences include work for Indiana Congressman Mike Pence, as well as 2 congressional campaigns in Colorado, including the 2006 campaign of now Colorado Congressman Scott Tipton. Chase is also a 2008 graduate of the Indiana Leadership Forum. Chase and his wife Gloria live in Indianapolis, where they're both active parishioners at St. Monica Catholic Church. The couple has a beagle named Bob. I've got a cat named Spot. And is expecting their first child this January. Let's give a big hand for Chase Downham.
For the introduction, and actually that little boy of ours is now 7 months old, so that the bio is a little dated. Are we going to try and switch over for the PowerPoint presentation? Oh, yeah. So that I can still talk about my background and a little about Americans for Prosperity Foundation. My name is Chase Downham. Just like the introduction said, I'm the Indiana State Director of Americans for Prosperity Foundation. And growing up in Muncie, Indiana, just actually in a small town just south of Muncie in Delaware County, got my start in this line of work working for Mike Pence over in Central Indiana. Most recently, for the last 5 years, worked with the Indiana Chamber of Commerce, helping small business owners get elected to the General Assembly. Actually, I spent quite a bit of time in Owen County back in 2008 working for Bob Heaton when he ran against Vern Tincher. And if Bob didn't knock on your door, it was probably me. And also did some work for him last time when he ran this year in 2010. So very familiar with Owen County. It's a pleasure to be back here and a pleasure to be with you tonight. Just to let you know a little bit about Americans for Prosperity Foundation. We're an organization that actually started back in 2004, and we started in 3 states, Kansas, North Carolina, and Texas. And the idea of this organization starting out was to advance the whole concept of economic freedom at the grassroots level. And it was when, it was pretty recently here, just this last fall, I was approached by a friend of mine, actually one of the guys I had worked for in Colorado, now runs the state chapter of Americans for Prosperity Foundation out there, contacted me and said, Chase, we're looking to start a state chapter in Indiana. Is this something you'd be interested in? And I thought a lot about it and really jumped at the opportunity because, as I see it, there's really no other organization like this in Indiana. We have a lot of great statewide organizations, but very few that work at the grassroots level, at the local level, to advance the whole concepts of economic freedom. So I got involved, saw this as an opportunity to really build something here in Indiana from the ground up. Like I said, our organization started back in 2004, and from that time we've grown down to 34 state chapters, Indiana being one of the newer state chapters. And prior to us having a state chapter here in Indiana, we were, Americans for Prosperity is probably an organization you've heard of before, maybe. We were one of these groups that would come through Indiana. We do bus tours, we have rallies and events. The Hands Off My Healthcare rallies, which took place about 3 years ago, that was Americans for Prosperity sponsored a tour. November is Coming is another tour that Americans for Prosperity did a couple years ago here in Indiana. And so we were one of these groups that were here in Indiana, but we weren't, we didn't have a state chapter that could then really get focused at the local level to make a difference. And so I think one of these previous slides, is it going on its own, or can we back up just a few? Sorry about that. Yeah. When I started with Americans for Prosperity Foundation, being a new state chapter, we still had a fairly good activist listing here in Indiana because of all those rallies and events that we had done before. So as you can see, this map here on the left is a pinpoint map of all the activists that have signed a petition, that have attended an event, that have been taking some action with Americans for Prosperity before. So as you can see, most of our activist base is in the more of the urban areas or more metropolitan where the population centers are. But it's pretty well diversified statewide. And we actually have activists in every county in Indiana. So we can go on to the next slide now. You know, the project that I'm here to talk about today, and this is kind of a good example of what we do as Americans for Prosperity. Really, what we're talking about today is it's really to bring some education on the recent reforms that we've experienced here in Indiana. I can tell you, being with this organization, my colleagues in other states are extremely envious of the things we've done here in Indiana. And I know it can be a little depressing sometimes when we hear about what's coming out of Washington, D.C. and when we see some of the regulations that are being forced upon us. But here at the state level, we believe that we've actually accomplished quite a bit over the last couple of years, and we have a lot to be proud of as Hoosiers. And I can tell you, my colleague in Illinois, just to give you an example, I mean, he's fighting battles he knows he's never going to win. He's fighting against the unions there and against a lot of other forces that he knows is going to make it very difficult for him to ever accomplish his goals. But he fights it anyways, and here in Indiana, we have the real opportunity to really experience true economic freedom at the policy level. So Indiana on Track is this program that we put together to look at some of the recent policy reforms that we've experienced and just kind of point out how they're benefiting our state, how they set Indiana on track. So it's good to start this discussion by really talking about this previous decade and where Indiana stood. As you can see, compared to our neighbors, we did fairly well with real GDP growth rate. This is one of the measures that folks typically use to compare one state to another. Our neighbors in Michigan and Ohio actually experienced negative GDP growth rate. Their economies had negative growth over a 10-year period, which is pretty unusual. And here in Indiana, while our number was positive, and while this looks pretty good regionally, these numbers were actually some of the lowest across the country. And as you can imagine, we took a pretty heavy hit in our manufacturing base and some of the other sectors of our economy. So Indiana really did have a tough decade from this last decade. Moving on, we really broke this program down into 3 policy areas that we're going to talk about, and just really talk about some of the myths behind them, kind of explain what they are and the positive benefit they've had in our state. The first one is right to work, and I'm sure many of you have heard about this being debated in the last legislative session. That was a very hot issue. It was something that was debated quite a bit, and I'm sure you've heard about it. But let's talk a little bit about right to work and what it means for Indiana. So we're going to talk about what right to work is, what it's not, and then what are some of the results. So really, and I think, anytime you're talking about some of these issues, there can be a lot of studies thrown out there, a lot of numbers, and it sometimes gets confusing as to what is at the core of an issue. And for right to work, the way that we saw it was that this was really a freedom issue, a freedom issue for individuals to decide whether or not they wanted to join a union or not. I mean, at the end of the day, when you broke it down for most Hoosiers and said, look, right to work simply means that you can't be forced into a union to get or keep a job, that decision belongs to you as an individual. Most Hoosiers agreed that that was the right thing to do. So right to work does not limit collective bargaining. It doesn't overturn existing union negotiations. There's actually a lot of companies that negotiate, but prior to right to work, those negotiations are still in place. So just to talk a little bit about what some of the results have been, and I think truly maybe the long-term results of right to work won't be known for another decade or two. But already we're seeing that there's increased activity of companies looking at Indiana wanting to locate here because of right to work. We've seen 46 companies, these are numbers from the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, 46 companies expressing some interest in locating in Indiana that previously were not looking at Indiana. And so we have 39 of these that are actually progressed and are looking at possibly 4,600 new jobs and $841 million in new investments. So, like I said, maybe the long-term effects are still yet to be seen, but here initially we've actually seen some positive things already, which is fairly surprising. 5 of these companies made it a point to say publicly that right to work was a major decision factor in them wanting to locate to Indiana. And we'll finish this section of talking about right to work by looking at right to work states versus non-right to work states. As you can see, the private job growth rate this last decade was positive in right to work states, even with it being a tough economy. The non-right to work states, it was negative. population growth was nearly double the rate. So on the face of it, it seems that right to work, it does have a positive benefit in our economy, and if nothing else, provides freedom to individual workers, like as we previously mentioned. And these are reforms that were mostly enacted in the 2011 legislative session. This was probably kind of the big area that people were focused on in that session. I think it's good to start this conversation talking about education reform in our state by just pointing out how much money as a state we spend on public education. As you can see, this last item here, K-12 education, that just by itself is 50% of the state expenditures. If you throw in higher education, you throw in teacher pensions, we're pushing close to 70% of annual state expenditures are being spent on public education. So the point we try to make here is that, look, if it was simply a matter of us not spending enough money, if we could only spend more, something to this argument, if we only spent more money, our public schools would be better. We already spend quite a bit of money, and we're not always getting the results we need. So the two things that we talk about when it comes to education reform that we'd like to point out is the Choice Scholarship Program. This is also known as the voucher program. And another issue is teacher performance pay. These seem to be two that a lot of folks have some concerns about, or at least typically you have some conversations about. So the Choice Scholarship Program, this is, like I said, this is known as the voucher program here in Indiana. It's actually a pretty large program, believe it or not. I mean, this was described nationally as the largest first-year school choice program in the country. And I can tell you my colleagues in other states are extremely envious that we have a program here in Indiana for low and middle income families to be able to send their children to the school of their choice. But there are some eligibility factors in whether or not you can receive a voucher. So it's based on income, it's based on availability, it's based on student status. Income, that's based on the free and reduced lunch program. But for a household that makes about $65,000 a year with a family of 4, those people do qualify for some type of voucher. So as you can imagine, when the average income here in Indiana is just under $40,000 a year for a household, $65,000 for a household of 4 to be able to receive some form of voucher, that applies to a lot of Hoosiers. And actually in its first year, this program had 4,000 kids enrolled. So 4,000 kids being able to go to the school of their choice. There is an issue of availability. In the first year, the program was capped at 10,000 students. This coming year, it'll be capped at 15,000, and then beyond, it'll be unlimited. So there was that issue. There was also an issue of student status. You have to attend at least 1 year of the public education system in order to qualify to receive a voucher. And I think the idea here was that before you could say we will not go to the public school, you have to at least try it. I would argue that some of these schools, you know enough about them to know whether or not it's good for your children, but that's the way it was set up. So how is this program benefiting Hoosiers? And really, like I said, it's benefiting families and children that receive the vouchers, obviously, because 4,000 in its first year, there's over 6,000 kids that are not going to receive a voucher for the next school year. So think about it, 6,000 kids of families that were in school systems that maybe weren't meeting their children's needs that now have an option, which is pretty neat. And it's also benefiting taxpayers. And what I thought was interesting about this is that a voucher here in Indiana is capped at $4,500 per child per school year. Here in Indiana, the state, to educate a child in the public school system, will spend over $9,000 per year per child. So in essence, it's benefiting us taxpayers for children to receive a voucher. The other issue that we want to talk about, teacher performance pay. I have 2 sisters who are public school teachers. My mom's a public school teacher. This is kind of the issue that gets talked about around the kitchen table. Well, how are they going to evaluate me? Am I going to be tied to my students' performance? Yeah, maybe I can control it, maybe I can't. I don't know if there's a perfect system out there, but simply asking that teachers be evaluated at some performance level, I think is pretty basic. Here in Indiana, most of us work at jobs where our income, our chances of receiving a better income or receiving a raise are somehow tied to our job performance. And I don't know how you get there exactly, but simply asking that teachers also have some type of a performance evaluation that is tied to their pay, tied to their to their merit is pretty reasonable, I believe. You know, rewarding good, effective teachers, asking those who aren't getting the job done to get better, paying people based on performance, not tenure, seems to make sense to us. And like I said, the performance evaluations are actually pretty well controlled at the local level. The state does set these performance categories, but how a local school corporation implements teacher performance pay and what they decide to evaluate teachers on is mostly up to the local school corporation to decide. The last issue we talked about is the situation. Obviously, an issue that affects us all. So looking at, next slide here, so we're talking about Indiana's taxes, we're going to talk about the death tax a little bit, and then we're also going to talk about the issue of taxpayer refunds. And I think it's good to talk about where Indiana stands in comparison to our neighbors once again as it pertains to taxes. And as you can see, Indiana actually has fairly low tax rates when you compare us to our neighbors. Our tax rate, this is a study done by the Tax Foundation, and they compare all the different taxes that the state proposes. Some of the major ones here are listed in comparison to all the other states and how they rank. As you can see, Indiana ranks anywhere from 18th to 10th on that list, depending on the tax. And as you can see also, we're the second group of columns there. Our taxes, our tax rates are fairly low in comparison to our neighbors. Now, the one thing I would point out is that Indiana as a whole, if you look at the Department of Revenue's annual report, we charge just over 40 different taxes and fees just at the state level. Now, obviously, that doesn't apply to everybody. Some taxes are for a particular industry or for a particular product, but we do charge over 40 different taxes and fees. I also would point out that while we're ranked 10th or 11th on most of those categories, the states that are ranked in the top 10 or the states that outrank us, most of them are missing some major form of tax. So either they don't have an income tax, they don't have a sales tax. One of those is actually missing. So for Indiana to kind of break into that area, there'd have to be some change there. But looking at the 10 best states for tax climate versus the 10 worst states, the numbers kind of speak for themselves. Low tax states have faster population growth. Low tax states have extremely faster growth in new jobs. These are numbers from the last decade. Personal income growth is higher in low tax states. So just looking at these numbers, you can quickly draw a conclusion that low taxes is good for Indiana. There has been some progress on this front here in Indiana. I think it's important to point out this is where some of these recent reforms come into play. The death tax, and this is also the inheritance tax, it was an issue that was dealt with this last legislative session. Here in Indiana, this wasn't a tax that was necessarily affecting everyone, but it was particularly hurting small business owners, small family businesses, and also farmers, because as you can imagine, as a small business owner, family-operated business, you might look like you have a lot of money on paper, but when you're talking about your business, the overhead involved there, the capital necessary to run a business, families were being taxed when they were passing that business down to the next generation. So this was something that we felt needed to go, and I'm glad to say that in the last legislative session, legislation was passed that will phase out the inheritance tax over the next 10 years. And this is because it's $165 million that's going to be off the books here within 10 years, maybe sooner. Another issue that I want to point out, this is something you might have read about in the papers, is the whole concept of the taxpayer refund. I'm not sure if you've seen this, but here in Indiana, when we have budget surpluses now, after we meet some financial responsibilities of making sure we have enough reserves and making sure that our pensions are covered, Indiana taxpayers actually receive a refund with any of the surplus money. So here in Indiana, I believe it was a $2 billion surplus that was incurred over this last year, which means that most Hoosiers that pay taxes are going to receive anywhere from $100 to $200 back in a refund. And I think what's really neat about this is that a couple things really. It recognizes that the money that the government has truly belongs to the taxpayer. It's on loan to the government. And so this, I think, reinforces that concept. I think it also creates an incentive for us as taxpayers to demand that our legislators, that our folks at the General Assembly create budgets that are tight, that are small, that can produce a surplus so that we can get a refund. So that, in essence, is our Indiana on Track presentation. It's, like I said, this came about because, as we talk about the different issues out there, certainly there's a lot to be frustrated with at that federal level. It occurred to us that here at the state level, at least, there are a lot of things that we've done very well. There's a lot of things that we can be proud about, and just wanted to provide some information about those reforms, about how they really have put Indiana on track for greater prosperity. There's a video at the bottom of the toolbar. You might find it there. If we could play that, I'll end with that. But all this information can be found at indianaontrack.com. We have a website. We also have some statewide radio advertising you might have heard about, some of the reforms. I've been through that way as well. Let's see if we can hold up here. Bottom right. There you go. Play, and it's just 90 seconds. So.
So they could go to the school of their choice and get the education they deserve. And the program is growing. Almost 5,000 kids are signed up for next year. Indiana's on track for hardworking teachers by rewarding those who help students achieve and helping those who aren't getting the job done to get better. Indiana's on track for workers by protecting their freedom to choose whether to join a union. Leading the Midwest, Indiana is the first state in the country to bring freedom to the workplace in over a decade. Indiana's on track for job creators by lowering the corporate tax rate and making Indiana the best state for business in the Midwest. Indiana's on track for family-owned businesses and farms by allowing owners to pass them down to the next generation without government penalty. And Indiana's on track for taxpayers who will get a refund when Indiana fills its reserves and meets all of its financial responsibilities. Indiana's reforms have accomplished a lot, but there's still more to do. Let's keep working. Let's keep Indiana on track. Learn more about how reforms are keeping Indiana on track at indianaontrack.com. Paid for by Americans for Prosperity Foundation.
So I'll just close by thanking you for allowing me to have some time here tonight. I know it's the last night of the county fair, so I appreciate you coming out here to listen to us. And we'd also just like to mention just how proud I am to be a Hoosier, and I know we all are. And that's kind of where all this came from, just being very proud about some of the things that we've done here as a state. There's always more work to do, but I think we're on track. And if you agree, feel free to go to the website, sign up there. You can also, there's some of these cards here on the back table here. If you'd like to be on our email list, if you're not already, just fill this card out. We can also send you a booklet that has a lot of this information as well, but those are available at the table. So thank you all very much. I appreciate it. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them now. I'll also be sticking around for a little while as well. So any questions at all? Yeah?
Why is it every time we have a conversation, no matter who's behind the microphone, it's always about taxes, it's never about spending. Spending's in the fine print. But why don't the conversation change to spending instead of taxes?
Right.
Less.
Well, I would, the taxpayer refund obviously is something that's tied to spending. One of the things we sometimes talk about, we didn't really get into it too much tonight, but it's this whole concept of tax and expenditure limits. And the taxpayer refund obviously is a part of that, but it's one of the things that a lot of state and local governments have done for the last few years, have enacted tax and expenditure limits. And basically what you're saying to the government is any given year you can only grow by so much. I think in Colorado is probably the best example of this, and I encourage you to look at the system they have. But in Colorado, they tie their growth, annual growth in government spending to a percentage of population growth and inflation. So basically what they're telling their government is no matter how good times are, no matter how much prosperity we have, no matter how much tax revenues you might receive in this year, you're only allowed to grow by so much, which I think is kind of a neat concept. But yeah. I agree with you. I think spending, you know, at the end of the day,
well,
spending's got to be kept in check.
My point is not necessarily, it's not so much directed at you.
Sure.
It's just in general. I mean, on TV, day after day after day, everything is about taxes. Raise taxes, lower taxes, do away with this tax, increase another tax. But you never hear about spending. I mean, it's just, you do, but it's just, I mean, it's kind of a byline. It doesn't really, it doesn't get much attention, it doesn't get much conversation, no matter who's talking.
Well, I think it's Grover Norquist who typically said, Americans for Tax Reform will say that the only way you can really keep spending in line or cut spending is to make sure taxes are low. Government typically spends every dollar they receive. Any other questions? But okay. Well, thank you all very much, and appreciate you listening to me tonight.